Hello class, today we're going to talk about the first constitution known as the Articles of Confederation. Then we're going to talk about the ratification of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. So, the first Constitution of the United States was known as the Articles of Confederation. This created a very weak central government where each state retained full sovereignty, basically operated as its own country, including diplomacy and military affairs. It can be compared to perhaps the European Union or even to an extent NATO, where essentially while each country, in this case state, is its own country with its own decisions and its own foreign policy, ultimately the main purpose was to provide for the common defense against European imperial powers, pretty much the British, the Spanish, and the French. So, under the Articles of Confederation, Americans had freedom of movement. The federal government had no power of taxation. It relied upon donations from the states, and most laws required unanimous consent. Because of how weak of a central government this created, this left the United States vulnerable both domestically and in foreign policy. So, domestically, what happened was we had Shays' Rebellion, which there we go. Okay, you can look at these graphs on your own time here. They'll help you understand the articles more. But Shays' Rebellion. So, imagine for a second you're a Revolutionary War soldier. You fought for years in very poor conditions, with oftentimes going hungry, without enough ammunition, clothes. Many American Revolutionary War soldiers did not have shoes, so they were walking around barefoot. And in order to fight in the war, you left your farm behind. While you were away, of course, your farm was reclaimed by nature, right? So weeds grew, your house wasn't taken care of, so on and so forth. You were promised a salary and you were promised a pension after the war. None of those benefits materialized. Your widow, if you were killed, was also promised a pension. She did not receive her pension if you were killed. So, American Revolutionary War soldiers were very upset after the war, especially because many of them had to turn over their farms to British banks due to the Treaty of Paris, which honored all private debts. So, as a result, Daniel Shay and 4,000 American soldiers, and now rebels, led an uprising. It wasn't really until George Washington stepped in out of retirement and put down the rebellion using his own force of personality and will, convincing the states to donate soldiers, troops to the fight, that this conflict ended. But essentially, this really showed how weak the United States government was. It didn't have an army. It didn't have any ability to fight this rebellion. It was basically helpless without George Washington stepping in. So as a result of that, elites around the country began to consider creating a new constitution. Now I say elites because this is very much, you could say, a second American Revolution of the elites. The average person was fine with the Articles of Confederation. They did not want a strong central government, and the Articles prevented a strong central government from being created. But the elites were very nervous and afraid that there could be other rebellions, and these rebellions perhaps could be over economic reasons, so like workers going after their bosses and so on and so forth. And so, essentially, it was decided that a new constitution needed to be written. Now, this was not, the actual United States government was not included in writing this new constitution. Essentially, once again, this is an elite revolution where there's a slow motion coup. of the United States government by these elites gathering in Philadelphia. So, how was it that these elites were able to create a constitution without even consulting the United States government? Well, they had a lot of big names that were part of it. George Washington, once again, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, so on and so forth. So these elites traveled to Philadelphia and they began to work on a new constitution. In any large group of people, there's going to be factions. There's going to be different groups with different objectives, and they're going to clash. So let's go over a few of these factions real quick. First, you have large versus small states. Large states wanted a more democratic form of government. Why? Well, because most of the population was in these large states. And so basically, if you had a Congress that was based off of population, then these large states would dominate this new United States government. And so that's why they advocated for a Congress that was based off of population. Then you had small states. Small states argued, no, we're not going to join this union if we don't get the equal say to the large states. Every state should have equal representation, essentially, is what the small states argued. So they wanted a system where you could have 5 million people in one state, 100,000 in another, but they would both have equal say in the federal government. That clash eventually led to the Great Compromise. So essentially both sides got a little bit of what they wanted. You had a Senate that was based off of equal representation. Every state had 2 senators, no matter how big their population. And then you had a House of Representatives that was based off of population. So the bigger your population, the more House members you had in Congress. Okay, so that's a very important compromise. It also led to the creation of the Electoral College, which we will talk about in more detail later. But we can still see this legacy to this day. People grumble a lot about the Electoral College, and they grumble a lot about the Senate, because, of course, the Senate is not a democratic institution. It's more of, well, you could say a representative republic, not to be confused with Republican, right? So you still have politicians bemoaning the fact that Wyoming and California have equal representation in the Senate. So it's still an issue to this day. Another big issue was North versus South, or free state versus slave state. It wasn't quite North versus South yet, since there were many northern slave states. And basically what these slave states wanted was a country or a government that counted slaves for the purposes of representation without granting them rights. So, as we talked about, we had this House of Representatives that's based off of population. Well, slave states wanted the House, the census, which determined how many, which was every 10 years, and determined how many seats a state got in the House of Representatives, to include slaves in their calculations, even though they were not allowed to vote. Free states argued, of course, that's not fair. If slaves aren't given the right to vote, they should not be counted for the purposes of political representation. And so out of this you get the most infamous compromise of the Constitution, the 3/5 clause. Okay, so this is where each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of apportioning representation. So that affected both the House as well as the Electoral College. Okay. And then we had industrial versus agrarian, different views of what the United States should look like in the future. Alexander Hamilton believed the United States should industrialize and become a powerful country. Then you had people like Thomas Jefferson, who was not here at the Constitutional Convention, but his followers were, who believed that being a nation of small farmers would maintain a culture of freedom. And so, we don't really have a lot of time to go into detail on this, but it was very important. Okay, so as a result of these compromises, you got a constitution, but the constitution still needed to be ratified. So, the Federalists who supported the Constitution got together to write a series of essays explaining the Constitution and advocating for its ratification. These Federalists were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Okay? And so they went around and published these essays. We're going to talk briefly about them. I know I want to keep this video under 15 minutes, but let's discuss this. Federalist number 10 was written by James Madison and discussed the nature of a large republic, which is always going to include a lot of different groups. And so what he argued is that the Constitution would prevent any one group from becoming too powerful. And you can see this in the way the Constitution is designed. It is very difficult to pass legislation without getting an overwhelming majority of people to support it. It's still, you could say, a problem to this day. A lot of people are upset about the fact that Washington, D.C. is so slow to adopt policy. Well, that was part of the design. Madison also argued that there was a correct balance between the effectiveness of the federal government that was created and protection of liberty. So this was important to Americans to understand. Federalist number 17 discussed the nature of federalism. So federalism is not about federal supremacy. It's about splitting power between regional governments, we call them states, and a central government, which we call the federal government. So don't get that confused. Federalism is not about federal superiority. It's about sharing power, decentralizing power. Of course, power was more centralized under this new U.S. Constitution than the old one, but still a pretty decentralized system compared to other countries. Federalists 45 and 46 talked about trying to address the fear that many Americans had of a powerful federal government, and basically argued there's nothing to worry about. If the federal government became too powerful, the states would simply replace it, overthrow it, defeat it. This is an area where perhaps, the framers were wrong. Separation of powers in Federalist 51. The idea here is every branch is going to pursue its rational self-interest, and so part of their rational self-interest will be to prevent other branches of government from becoming too powerful, so everybody balances each other out. Federalist 57 discusses the House of Representatives. It talks about how it's meant to be close to the people. They're given a 2-year term, which means they have to really pay attention in order to get reelected. They're also given the power of the purse, and they have the ability to initiate impeachment proceedings. Federalist 63, discusses the Senate. Each senator has a 6-year term in office, and this is meant to protect senators from political whims. What does that mean? Well, essentially, the longer your term in office, the less you have to worry about getting reelected. So only 1/3 of the Senate was ever up for reelection at one time. Also, senators were not elected as we would consider it today. They were chosen by the state legislature. By their state legislature, I should say. This was until the 17th Amendment, which would come about in the Progressive era, which would change senators' election process so that they were elected directly by the people. Okay. Federalist 70 and 71 talked about the presidency. These were written by Alexander Hamilton, who was a big fan of executive authority. He argued that really there is only one person in the United States government that represents everyone, and that is the president. If you think about it, members of the House represent their districts. Members of the Senate represent their states. So who represents the country as a whole? Well, Hamilton argues that's the president. And so as a result, the president should have robust authority. The president is the head of state and head of government in many countries, including democracies. Those two offices are separated out. So like in Israel, you'll have a prime minister and a president. In the UK, you'll have the queen, the king now, who is the head of state, and the prime minister is the head of government. The head of state is ceremonial, unites the country. The head of government does the actual governing. But in the United States, that is all concentrated into one person. Okay. And then Federalist 84 argues the Bill of Rights is a bad idea. Why would somebody argue that? Well, essentially, it comes down to this. The way the Constitution was written, it affirmatively listed the powers of government. If a power was not listed in the Constitution, then the federal government didn't have it. And so what Federalists argued was that there was no need at all to have a Bill of Rights because the federal government was not given the power to do things like regulate freedom of speech or religion or guns, things like that. And so there was no need to have a Bill of Rights at all. It would cause a dangerous misunderstanding of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists, who opposed the Constitution, of which there were many, including Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry and so on, argued that there had to be a Bill of Rights, otherwise the federal government would continue to grow in power and strength and would trample on these rights. Okay, so after 10 months and a vigorous campaign, the Constitution was ratified. You can look at, for review, these compromises here. We're at about our 15-minute mark, so I am going to go ahead and end this video. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.